Well, welcome to the Stewart Squared podcast. We're down here in Buenos Aires. We're actually in separate locations so that we can easily do video because video is such a challenging medium to create good quality content, whereas audio is so easy. But we're going to talk today about the rise of the early PC industry, the rise of the internet, and the rise of the mobile phone as it relates to the future of AI. Let's talk about what Satya Nadella talked about and what the ways that we were right, because we've been talking about everything that Satya Nadella said, which is that the capital expenditures are way too large and nobody's going to get their money back. And this has all been done before. And now we're finally at the point where it's happening, right? Like where we were proven right for the past 6 months.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what's wrong with saying that? Uh, yeah, Satya's a pretty rational guy, uh, and he's sort of not a product of Microsoft's history. Um, I can't remember if we have mentioned this on the podcast, but I read Bill Gates' first of three autobiographical editions called Hardcore, and uh, I think that's no source code. That's what it
Yeah,
is.
good name for an
And
author.
but hardcore could have been the name because that was the ruling ethic of Microsoft being hardcore, and you see why it's true from his first
What is
autobiography, which is when he was a kid, he learned how to program by thinking because there's no interactivity. You had to come up with a program, you had to run the program, and if it didn't work, then you had to figure out what was wrong. The computer didn't help you out in any way. And that only came later. And so he learned how to write BASIC in the smallest amount of memory possible simply by thinking it through. And he went on these long walks and would go off into a zone where he was just thinking about the program while he was walking along. Um, and that's hardcore. And that was the core of Microsoft's culture. Hardcore programmers working for programmers as customers. And so there was an interregnum with the fellow named Steve Ballmer, who was almost Bill's co-founder. Paul Allen was really his co-founder. Um, when Steve ran the company, and he was a live large, big-hearted kind of guy, and he tried to change the culture and did transactions for Microsoft that were not successful. And a lot of people felt that Microsoft had gone sideways. So the board finally removed him. And no, no shame on him because he's a multi-billionaire and owns like basketball teams now. Um, and um, and then put Satya Nadella. And as Satya Nadella had worked at Microsoft and was sort of a product of the hardcore culture, but is much more balanced in the way he thinks about running the company. And so this whole thing that's happened with OpenAI and Microsoft being their partner, um, and the whole San Francisco AI thing happening of, well, just spend more money and buy more NVIDIA chips and build more server farms and be able to manage bigger and bigger large language models. Um, uh, he just looked at that and said, and that's the tweet was it a tweet? No, it was a quote.
No, he went
Um,
on a podcast by Dwarkesh Patel and basically strategically released the news that Microsoft was not doing capex, and so the I sent you a summary from that tweet or from
yeah,
that
and
podcast.
it's from that podcast, but it's they're still spending billions of dollars on capex.
Yeah,
It's not like they've stopped, but they're not investing in making bigger and bigger NVIDIA-based server farms. Um, they've got what they think they need, and relying on everybody else to do it. But so there's, I mean, multiple levels here, and then you have to evaluate, well, is Satya right or wrong?
yeah.
Um, he's unique. He's the only one that's decided that this is not a good idea, at least visibly. And um, and it, comes a little bit after DeepSeek was introduced, and uh, but I don't think Satya is like going, "Oh, look at DeepSeek. I'm not going to do that anymore." Um, so there are multiple layers of this, and you have to understand the technology, the underlying technology, to decide if he's right or wrong. And You know that in fact, you started me on this, but this interview you did with the CEO of Numenta, that the true nature of AI, if it's going to mimic the human brain, it has to mimic the human brain. And the human brain is capable of processing all information in real time with very little power and very little NVIDIA chips. And with a general CPU, central processing unit, i.e. the brain. So that's my notion of where AI has to end up going. And there's been signs of this, and DeepSeek is one of the signs that they were able, whatever the truth is, that they were able to produce a large language model on $5 million or $6 million, maybe by stealing it from OpenAI or whatever. But uh,
It's like both.
and it turns out,
I would say that DeepSeek was both. It's like they both weren't accurate, weren't fully honest, which is common from Chinese based entities. That they weren't honest about what they trained it on, but at the same time they did something pretty important in terms of creating this.
remarkable.
Yeah.
It's not that they weren't totally honest. And the funny thing is that DeepSeek doesn't really talk much.
Yeah.
So when people ascribe intent or motivation to them, it's like, where are they getting that? They're just kind of making it up.
Yeah.
I guess in the world of Trump, that's how you do it. But
Well, yeah, many such cases in our current environment, as we've discussed before, the media environment has been going a lot through my head of that there are no more trusted mediaries, and so it's like the ultimate end of the Protestant Revolution, because the Protestant Reformation was all about.
wow. Let's step further out. Let's go back to Satya Nadella.
Okay.
So, but the trend line has to be that you end up where the Numenta CEO thinks we should be, or Numenta thinks we should be, which is mimicking the human brain, which uses 2.5 watts and just sits in our craniums. No large language models required. And so if you believe that and you can see forward and understand what you believe is going to happen, then you have to give Satya Nadella credit for having that intellectual process, for thinking that through and saying, well, this is not the way it's going to end up. So we're going to go in a different way. Now, he's running a gigantic company that has enormous economic power in the technology industry, mainly because of the smart decisions he's made since he became CEO, 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe it's even longer. And so he's operating from a position of power and influence. So there's not a huge amount of risk in him deciding to let everybody else spend the money on the capital expenditures. And then it's also, how relevant is it to Microsoft's business that they get on the forefront of, and their decision to partner with OpenAI at some level was saying, it doesn't really matter if we do it. We'll just go find the guys that are doing it. Then we'll partner with them. And they came up with this crazy ass deal with OpenAI to try to work around the fact that OpenAI was a not-for-profit. And
Yeah,
which OpenAI is trying to extract itself from now.
Yeah.
So that some level, Satya Nadella is also saying he doesn't believe that the profits that OpenAI is supposed to produce based on their agreement is going to actually work.
Yes.
And so he's sort of written that off.
Yeah. And he's in there, and this goes into my question that's been percolating in the back of my mind. At first, I thought you were saying that Satya Nadella is an outsider CEO, but he was at Microsoft, so he's not an outsider CEO, but he thinks differently.
He's a lifer. He's only worked at Microsoft, so yeah.
And so I wanted to ask about the difference between outsider CEOs and insider CEOs, and why would a company bring in an outsider CEO like Apple? I think, with John Scully, like why did that happen? But I think the more important question, or the more important analogy, because you're talking about all these court politics of they say these things publicly, they don't say these things publicly. There's all these things going on. DeepSeek's not talking, and there's all this making up of things that are happening. And it sounds like a court for a king. Is the CEO a king? And also, how does it relate to somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, or Elon Musk, who is sort of like a digital warlord who exists outside of the state, and the state can't figure him out, and now has entered the state. And Zuckerberg was also doing that from a different political perspective. What's your take on all of that stuff? Yeah.
There are many different kinds of kings.
Yeah.
King George, is that who's running? No, not running. Who's king of England right now? Um, has almost no power,
Yep.
and really doesn't try to use it.
Yeah.
So when people throw words like that around, you have to be really careful what you're talking about. They're using the word with Trump because everybody suspects that Trump really wants to be a dictator like Putin, and he doesn't say much about Xi Jinping, but that would be the other obvious corollary. And it's not clear that Trump's got enough going on upstairs to actually think that through. He likes gold-plated bathroom accessories and airplanes, and he likes to live like a king. But being a king, there's a very sophisticated, nuanced thing.
Yeah, being a culture and political.
Being a good one.
Yeah, being political. Well, there's a lot of bad kings as well, but I want to focus this really not on Trump and not on political kings.
Yeah, you're talking CEOs.
Yeah, but they are now becoming political. There is that political thing, but I want to talk about first what is a CEO, and what is this like court politics? Were you guys sitting around watching Apple, because Apple was really secretive, and thinking, like what is going on behind the scenes? Can you talk more about what happened with Apple in this regard?
Yeah, you're talking about the Scully era.
Yeah.
There's two people that ran Apple after Steve left. One was John Scully, who was CEO at the time, actually. It was just that he and Steve became less friendly, and the board backed Scully. So there was a lot of intrigue around that. And there are a lot of details. Try not to get lost in the details, but basically, Steve hired Scully, and they were, finishing each other's sentences and working together really well. But Scully really didn't have the same sensibility, and he really did like to tell people.
Why didn't Steve
Go ahead.
take the job himself? Because now it's so interesting, because starting in 2000 and maybe 2010, you had really young CEOs, right? But back then, Steve Jobs, he was young. He knew that he wasn't ready for CEO. Is that an accurate statement?
No,
No.
That's not. The board felt that he was not doing a good job as CEO, and the board hired a new CEO. Steve bought into Scully, right, and recruited him and endorsed him as CEO. But ultimately, Scully was used to kind of what you're talking about, boardroom politics, or whether it's court politics. But that's that's the world he grew up, became a CEO at PepsiCo. And so there's a dynamic between the board and the management team and the CEO, and you have to kind of work your way through the politics of that. And that's what he brought to Apple. And so ultimately, it became a power struggle. And that was really Scully that made it a power struggle. And so he managed to get the board to remove Jobs and put him in what was called Siberia. And so, I mean, that was boardroom politics, pure and simple. And
so that gives me a really good framework. So it's basically CEO, as we discussed at AI Whispers last week, is the pig, is not the chicken laying eggs on your breakfast table. It's the pig, it's the pork, it's the bacon, speaking in tongues, doing all these things, creating this company. It's sort of like the strange role that can't really be defined. And then you have the board, and the board is a check and the balance on the CEO once it's exited startup world. And then you have the management executive layer. So those are the three main.
Well, you have the whole employee base, and you have the customers. You have a bunch of
shareholders,
communities you have to serve. And you use the word CEO, but actually, in the case of Jobs, and more typically, it's the founder. Founder is a different role than CEO, and so a founder CEO, who's both the founder and the CEO, is a rare breed. usually founders get replaced as CEO
because
many times voluntarily,
they can't handle
but
the
because they know they're not good at leading a company. They're better at doing something else. This is the Silicon Valley asshole theory,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Who are the ones that survive as CEO? Who are the founders that survive as CEO until the company has more than $1 billion of revenue? Because once you have $1 billion of revenue, you're not really a startup anymore, although people use that term loosely. And so you have a lot of employees and you have the infrastructure and you're probably a public company by then and you have a board of directors and you start to have that whole dynamic going on. And many founders don't want to engage in that, much less, and many of them try to hold on and then get thrown out. That's
Mm,
what happened with Jobs.
mm.
Jobs realized that he'd made a mistake with Scully and
Tried to
tried to
correct it.
fight it, but the board decided in favor of Scully.
So,
And then he went into the wilderness and came back later.
how does the board get power in that whole range from the startup to the large company making $1 billion in revenue? How does the board get power, and how does Zuckerberg basically seems to be totally acting outside of any sort of board, has managed to just keep
Yeah, there
control
are
over
weak
the
boards.
weak boards? Yep.
You have to have a strong board or a weak board. And boards are, it's a really mysterious thing because even though they try to write rules about how boards are supposed to
Yeah.
provide governance and oversight, that's not the way it works. Because if you're a director, a member of a board of directors, you're not working for the company. You show up at a board meeting and whatever, maybe once a quarter, or in the case of smaller companies, you want to do it more frequently. So maybe once a month or every 2 months, or so you're keeping track of the company from remote in between. And then you show up at the board meeting and the CEO controls what is talked about. And once the board starts to go, this isn't going right, then stuff happens. And if you look around at boards, uh, there are companies that have really aggressive boards of directors
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
take their job seriously and are providing oversight. But the board can't run the company because it's composed of people that don't work for the company. Maybe the CEO's on it and maybe one other, but and usually in a bigger company, the boards are much bigger, like
So, have you studied how Zuckerberg
12.
did it? How did he manage
Zuckerberg
to?
Zuckerberg still maintains control, voting control. He's a shareholder that has more votes than any other shareholder. So he still gets to decide okay, that's one of the
Yeah,
dynamics.
yeah.
You have shareholder votes and you have director votes, board votes. Boards are responsible for certain things, but in order to make major changes, they
Uh,
have to get shareholder approval, like changes in how the capital structure of the company is. Zuckerberg still has control of the shareholder vote, even
yes.
though he's been heavily diluted and doesn't own as much. And we could look that up. But
Yeah. How did he do that?
um, his early investors endorsed it and made it happen, and it was
Uh,
preserved through their public offering. um,
wow. Okay.
Usually, when you go public, you have to give up shareholder control. But in the case of Facebook, Meta now um, happened so fast and became public so fast, there was very little development that happened in between. Mark Zuckerberg has always been CEO, and even when Sheryl Sandberg was showing a little too much guff,
Whoa.
she got thrown out.
That's a very interesting point. That relates to the second convergence, the networks, because we've been talking about Apple. Apple was a slower company because it was building hardware. It was laying the foundation. Apple and Microsoft were laying the foundation, although Microsoft is a little bit more in the software, which gets to my point about Zuckerberg. But they were much longer periods of time, much slower evolution. And then all of a sudden you get the internet, and then you get Zuckerberg creating a closed garden on the internet, and it happened
One of the
very
remarkable
quickly.
things about one of the remarkable things about Facebook/Meta is that they bought Instagram and paid so much for it so early. He and WhatsApp. Um, when you look at, kind of what the surviving pieces of social media are, they own them all except for Twitter. And Twitter was always a damaged good. Maybe it still is, but who knows? Um,
Let's go into that.
the but early on he bought these pieces, so he had a vision for how all this stuff should work together. And the whole VR AR thing is coming later, but so Zuckerberg, at some level, he deserves to be king because he's made the right decisions all the way
Yeah.
through. So even now being masculine and in a Trump era in order to preserve some
Yeah.
political influence is a smart move.
Well,
He's
he's really smart. That like that. There's no question that he's really smart. And as you just described, he can see into the future and he can manage things better than almost probably anyone else in the world at the moment. But he also sort of made the wrong decision, and for the last 4 years, in terms of the future, because he didn't see that one coming, and he sort of like played it really late, whereas Elon Musk played it much earlier.
he can't really call it wrong. He was under intense pressure to
Yeah, yeah,
control
yeah,
misinformation,
yeah,
and
yeah,
which effect was widely perceived as affecting the elections. And
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't think that's widely perceived anymore. Um, it's not like Truth Social made Trump president.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's any layer of analysis that which you approach the whole breaks down because it's just too big. You can't model the whole thing. Like you can't understand all of the things in the future and under. But this is what good.
No, this is what I'm talking about with
Yeah,
Satya Nadella,
yeah,
right? He's looking forward and going, look, in the main, this is just not going to happen. 5 years from now, we're not going to be spending this kind of money and buying
yeah,
these kind of chips. Something's going to change. And so he's going to make that bet now, not going to wait. And is Sam Altman smarter than he is?
mm.
Sam's about, what, 30 years younger, and has a lot less experience, never run a major company before,
Yeah,
and is clearly, you know, more, I mean, you can't say that he's unethical because you could say that Mark Zuckerberg is
yeah,
evil,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
He's got no soul. He's not operating out of a ethical environment. He's
yeah,
entirely operating in a business environment, which many people accuse Bill Gates of doing too.
yeah.
But um, so
This is the hard part because this is the question about the kings and everything like that. Because when you're operating at that level, the ethics almost sort of like it's Machiavellian, right? Like it's too big. Like because other people are going to do it, right? So there's like Steve Jobs, he was an asshole, but he felt like he was operating from principles. I don't feel like Bill Gates is operating from principles. I don't feel like Zuckerberg is operating from principles. What do you think?
um, the difference is that Steve's prime directive was the consumer,
Mm.
the user,
Mm.
person who bought his product and used it. Um, and so he was a really ethical guy, and
Yeah.
if you read the book, whichever one you read, um, he had a great family. He
Yeah.
lived a really good family life. And unfortunately, didn't take his cancer seriously, but so he passed early. But um,
Mm.
it's I don't know. That's a tough one to get into, but you know, because you look at they're not the only CEOs we're talking about here.
Yeah. Let's
Brian
talk about
Chesky
Dell.
seems
Let's talk about Michael
or
Dell
Dell.
because yeah,
Yeah.
you've mentioned several times with this past week that he just represents something different. He's the exception that proves the rule for the asshole theory. Can you go more
hmm
into how you first met him and who like how go explain that more?
So Dell was a phenomenon, started in the PC industry, assembling PCs in Austin, Texas, and they weren't really factories; they were assembly rooms out of piece parts bought from Taiwan and China and other, not so much China, mostly Taiwan and American, but assembled in the U.S. And so he started in his dorm room assembling computers himself and then selling them to his college um, uh, buddies. And it started to scale. So then he moved out of the dorm room and into, I mean, literally. So the first time I met him was about 6 months after he moved out of the dorm, might be a year. Um, and we went to Austin and he drove me around in his MG. He had an MGB GT with a radar detector on the dashboard and drove really fast and went from one factory to another and showed me how they were all I call them factories, but they weren't really these assembly lines. These people, mostly migrant workers, assembling computers, and just full of energy and I can't remember if he actually graduated from college or not, but so he's like in his early 20s, and the and then you just tracked him through the whole thing, and the way that he managed the company was always on the up and up. He was always very direct with people. He got married. He's had three daughters. It's like has this great family life. Is a totally nice guy. Maintains a Christmas card list, which I happen to be on.
So how
Um,
does he do it? How does his management style? He's a CEO who's managed to do it seemingly from a principled standpoint. How does that reflect inside of the company?
wow, people like working for the
Yeah.
company. It's much harder for me to tell now because the Dell Computer Inc. It's actually Dell Inc. Formerly, is way different than the one I got to know driving around with him in Austin. Right, they
Yeah.
used to assemble PCs. Now they're an enterprise server
Okay.
company and they build these complex systems and
Oh,
they still sell PCs, but it's like
wow.
a little net. It's a very small part of the business.
They sell complex
Yeah.
systems. What does that mean?
Uh, well, if you're a company and you have servers and server farms and you buy computers from Dell and they help you hook them all together, um, that's beginning to change. But that's I can't really track what Dell's business is now. They haven't grown a lot. Um, I haven't really paid attention, but they're worth like 80 or 90 billion dollars. But it's only 80 or 90 billion. It's no longer, it's not the kind of company that turned into a $1 trillion company, right?
Mm,
80 or 90 billion. That's nothing to sneeze at, but it's now a minor computer company.
yeah. So let's go back to the beginning. They're assembling these parts. When you visited in your when he was in his 20s in the British car, uh, where did it go after that? How do they fit in? Because let me explain what I think is going on is that you have Apple created the revolution with their first computer. Then you have Microsoft allying with Apple, creating the software
Yeah,
for a lot of the things.
big mistake. No,
Oh yeah.
Microsoft allied with IBM.
Oh, okay.
Microsoft's deal was made by MS-DOS, which was the operating system that IBM
Got
put
it.
on its computers.
Got
So
it.
IBM introduced their PC in 1983. The first one was in 1981. Um, and then they introduced more and more computers and they built a multi-billion-dollar business very quickly, all with Microsoft's operating system. And so people have built application software to work with MS-DOS. The first apps, WordPerfect and stuff like that.
Mm,
Um, and Lotus 123, which was the spreadsheet before Excel. Um, and then later on, Microsoft built its own applications business. And they did some of the early apps on the Macintosh where there was no competition. Um, and started to rule the applications business on the Macintosh. But then they used the learnings from that to build it on the PC as well, which led to Microsoft Office, which is the bundle of Excel, Word,
but they never got into
PowerPoint.
hardware, right? Microsoft never built computers.
Oh no, they've done hardware.
Oh, okay.
Xbox is a big example.
Oh, Xbox, of course. Yeah, yeah. That's funny.
And they built
Uh,
keyboards and mice and stuff like
uh,
that, but they
uh,
never built computers.
why didn't
They
they do it?
couldn't well, they couldn't compete with Dell and the other 100 other companies who were making computers running Microsoft's operating system. They wanted to, boy, did they want to, but they couldn't figure out how to do that.
Were there experiments where they tried with the real computer? And when did
Uh,
that
they
happen?
they introduced a thing called in Japan. See if I can remember what it's called. They introduced a computer in Japan where it wasn't an issue because the dominant computer vendor was NTT.
Whoa.
NTT used MS-DOS, but they used a different version than the rest of the world. So, but they were the dominant computer vendor because Japan's a completely different market. But they introduced a um, home computer. Gilman wrote software for it, so that's what I'm trying to remember. But it never really scaled. And then NTT switched and started Then everybody started doing the standards, and NTT lost their market share.
Okay. There's a whole other thread that we haven't discussed and it's
Oh
actually
yeah,
relevant to my life. I remember you coming back from a vacation. You brought me a toy from Japan. It was probably like a 6 or 7 years old. We were at the house in Dale, um, and uh, and so there's an interesting avenue of Japan. But I want to go back to Dell first.
yeah, that's a whole different story.
Yeah,
Very, very different story. Japan's
yeah,
always been different.
yeah. Which is interesting for geopolitics. But Dell. So Microsoft created the software. They couldn't compete with Dell. Why couldn't they compete with Dell? What had happened before that?
God, there's this whole. So remember that I testified in Congress
Yeah,
about Microsoft as a monopoly.
yeah,
um, and it was Bill Gates, Scott McNealy, Jim Barksdale, Michael Dell, and Doug Burgum and me. And Michael Dell was there to testify about their relationship with Microsoft. And he did not tell the whole story, uh, which I happen to know because one of NEA's investments, where I became the board member, was a company called B Inc. from Jean-Louis Gasset, who had built a competitive operating system. And Dell was serious about looking at it and putting it on a computer. And but then suddenly said no. Nobody knows for sure, but they probably got the word from Microsoft that they weren't allowed to do that. Dell
oh,
was public about wanting to build Unix computers, but they also never built any Unix computers. So Microsoft was exercising its influence over computer companies. So they're sitting there forcing the computer companies to pay them money for their operating system with no competition, right? They're the only source. And how do they build a computer using their operating system when they're screwing all their hardware partners? It was too much money. They were making so much money from MS-DOS and then from Windows that it would be stupid of them to build their own computer.
why is a big question, but why are the principles of the universe set up so that a company does that and tries to build a monopoly? Why do monopolies exist and why are they so common? Or why is that the goal?
So they're not common. I've
Right, yeah,
often
yeah,
said as an investor, I really want to invest in a company that becomes a monopoly
yeah,
because then you get hauled in front of the Department of Justice, and by that time you're this huge company making
yeah.
billions of dollars. It's
And you
like,
can't be shut down like Microsoft has not been shut down. Like there's nothing that happened out of that.
well,
Well, yeah,
they
well,
try.
yeah, yeah,
They're even trying again.
yeah,
They're taking another run at it.
yeah,
Um, Although it's not
yeah.
clear
The
the
DOJ
Justice Department will
is going to
be doing
reverse
anything
that.
the same.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, so, I mean, monopolies they're not common. I
yeah,
wouldn't say that, but opportunities happen every time technology shifts
yeah.
from one microprocessor to another, from one operating system to another, from one architecture to another. And if you catch the wave and you get in there and you have the best or you own the best solution, a lot
Yeah.
of people thought my MS-DOS was a terrible operating system, but
Yeah.
IBM endorsed it, so it became the standard. Um, then you have an opportunity to become a monopoly. And that's a complicated structural thing to talk about, but that's true. I mean, Apple's never been a monopoly, although they got sued by the Justice Department because they controlled the App Store
Yeah.
on their phone, right?
They have a
So if
monopoly
you're
within their system.
within their own system, it's
Yeah.
like it was a really weird thing. And you know, the whole case got argued through, and it was Tim Sweeney from Epic was like a major endorsement for the suing Apple because he didn't want to have to pay them the 30% fee.
Okay. Oh man, there was a great question I had. The monopoly. They create these monopolies. Well, what is that revolution? So in AI, we can go back to what we started with. So Satya Nadella says, okay, capex, large amounts of money don't matter in the way that everybody is thinking. So he kind of puts a little pin in the bubble, but it doesn't seem like the bubble is actually able to burst. Like doesn't seem like other people are really
Well, there's
agreeing.
a lot of vested interest in those
Yes, yes, yeah,
overfunded AI companies. They're not
yeah,
going to give up easily.
yeah. Until when? Well, until when, and also what is the monopoly that can be built in terms of AI, if any, or is it some sort of thing
It
that
doesn't
transcends?
feel like there's a structural
Yeah,
monopoly there.
yeah,
There's no core
yeah,
proprietary,
yeah. I agree.
and that's the essence of the conversation about open source versus
Yeah,
proprietary,
yeah.
right? OpenAI is proprietary. Ironically, it was supposed to be open source, and but and is Claude open sourced? I
No,
can't
no,
remember
no.
which
They're
one's
they're
which, but
closed source. They're closed source. But the thing that I'm using every day that's totally changed my life that they built is basically open source. It's like a meta API on an API. It gives the LLM the ability to call any tool, and they've basically opened that up so that any third party can develop on it. And this is
yeah,
interesting.
there's a
Yeah,
lot of nuance in there. You have to find
yeah,
the line between proprietary and open source because
yeah. Okay.
in open source there's a different model where you give the software away for free
Yeah,
openly,
yeah.
and then you develop relationships with enterprises based on servicing the software and providing maintenance and
That
support.
I can't believe we have never talked about this. What is your version of the history of open source? When did it start? What's the deal with open source?
There's a book,
Yeah.
and the book started the open source thing, and it was written
Ooh.
by a guy named Richard something or other. And okay, it's got a great name. I read
Yeah,
the
I'm gonna
book
find it.
a long
Yeah,
time ago,
yeah.
30, 25, 30 years ago. Um, and it basically proposed a different
Cathedral in the
system for
Bazaar.
software. That's it,
Okay.
Cathedral in the Bazaar.
Oh.
Um, and Richard, what's his name?
It's Eric S. Raymond.
Okay, there you go. Well, memory. Um, the Cathedral in the Bazaar, it was an amazing book to read because it posited an entirely different system than existed. And it was based on the premise that software should be free and that you should get the economic benefit after the software is adopted. And
Uh huh.
there's a whole schema for how open source projects get adopted and supported, and it becomes a different competitive environment. And a company called Red Hat was one of the first that actually built a business out of it. And I actually don't know. I think they got bought by IBM, which meant they disappeared. But um, the uh, so it's a different model, and it's been decades since it was proposed, and um, the penetration of open source software is ubiquitous in the sense that it exists in a lot of different places, like in cybersecurity and
But
other domains.
Unix was open source.
Unix was not open source.
No,
No,
Unix was closed source, and then people built on
no,
Unix.
just hold on.
Oh,
Linux. Linux is an open source version of Unix. Unix is owned by
yeah,
AT&T.
yeah,
It was
yeah,
developed and owned by AT&T.
yeah,
Linux is an open source version of Unix,
yeah.
which is now really the predominant
Why
instance
are all
of
the
Unix.
servers on Linux? Why did that happen? Well,
Uh,
remote servers, cloud servers.
yeah, um, because they are programmed for and maintained by competent engineers who understand how to write against Unix. Unix is a complicated and hard
Uh,
to
uh,
develop for applications for the operating system. Uh, the core of the Mac OS is Linux.
yeah, Linux,
So
not
when
Unix.
Steve,
Linux, not Unix.
well,
Okay.
I'm not totally
Yeah,
positive
yeah,
because when Steve left Apple
yeah.
and started Next, he had to build an operating system, and he started with, I think it was Linux, but Linux may not have been fully developed, so it might be Unix. But
Yeah.
there is a core in there, which is, in fact, why Apple's been able to move the operating system from one microprocessor to another without creating any
Ooh.
disturbance.
Oh.
They've gone through two microprocessor transformations, the latter of which they went to their own architecture based on ARM,
Hmm.
which is incredible. No company's ever done that before.
Okay, I have a really orthogonal question, which is funny because it goes back to a story about hearing the word orthogonal. Oh man. So, oh man, I lost it. A total fail
Yeah.
there.
That's what happens when you think in an orthogonal way.
Yeah,
You can't get back to the beginning. It's like
Oh man. So okay, well I'll go back to a backup question about. No, no, I got it. Okay, how you talk about really complex things. We've always talked about really complex things, and I think part of the show is just us both nerding out on those complex things. Uh, and I realize that I now have different complex things that I'm interested in, but we have a lot of complex things that we're both interested in. And you are known for making those complex things very simple for a wide audience who weren't interested in the complexity. How do you do that?
I be the audience.
You step into the shoes
I
of the
mean,
audience. Yeah,
I'm an English major, doesn't know anything about technology. So
yeah.
the only way
You
that
are
I've
the
been able
audience. Yeah,
to understand this is to be
yeah.
able to interpret it in a way that I can understand it. But I used to struggle with thinking, God, this is early on. But, um, my first job at IDG I had a weekly newspaper for the trades that had three different names while I was editor. Because we adopted a new name and I got sued because it was too close to somebody else's name. We had to change it again. Um, and I think it was ended up being called Micro Market World, which is horrible, horrible name. Um, but it was for retailers basically and distributors and value added resellers, VARs. And the whole idea was that if you take a product and then you add something to it, that would be adding value, and then you would sell it to your customers for something new, basically based on this other product. Um, and these are really technical. They're really not retailers. They're technical developers who could do applications development in a particular domain and make the computer system work. And it was really, really hinky. I don't think any of those companies exist anymore, um, but it was really geeky.
Mm.
I couldn't quite figure out what these companies did. And I'm sitting near the editor trying to write stuff for them.
Uh-huh.
And what I knew was I could write stuff that was interesting to me, but I wasn't ever sure that it's, the experience that I had at Inc. magazine where I really figured out pretty quickly that if we wrote about mini computers, people wouldn't read the articles. So I'm going like, I don't want to write about mini computers for this technical geeky audience, but maybe they actually want to read about them. And
Oh.
so I was always unsure that I was actually connecting with the audience. Then I went to Infulton and I knew, and it was much better. But
Wait. What did you
uh,
know about InfoWorld? What happened there?
because it's all about the personal computer,
Oh, got it.
and
Yeah, I got it.
it
Yeah,
was
you were in the arcane
it was
disciplines.
retailers and people that were supporting them in companies, and there was a community of interest around personal computers where it was technical, but it wasn't programming.
So why do you think you're drawn to complexity in this way from a layman perspective? Why is that of interest?
I don't even understand the question,
Mm.
but I think I can answer it thusly. Um, I was interested in computers the same way personal computers the same way everybody else was. It's like the
Uh-huh.
power of the individual,
Yeah.
right? The individual gets to
Yeah.
use this device that we're sitting in front of right now, and that's a really fascinating thing that started a whole process, and I
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even though the computers weren't very powerful and didn't work very well, the whole concept, the idea was empowering and interesting. Um, that kept right on through. That's why I have these moments of personal clarity and enthusiasm. When I first used the internet browser, when I first used the iPhone, you could see these things are massively empowering.
Yep.
That's why I'm still a little confused about AI because I don't see it being as personally. You're having to work really hard to try to figure out how to be an AI whisperer. That's
I,
not a.
no, I think it's the same thing. It's the same, and I think that you answered the question, which is uh, there's you're not interested in the random, Unix 2.7 that got sold off to some random company, although it's like an interesting data point. You're interested in, wow, there's a wave coming here that's going to affect a lot of people, and you're interested in understanding that wave and riding that wave, right?
It's interesting. There's a part of my career that never gets mentioned, which I'll mention now, that I started a newsletter when I was still in Boston called Soft Letter with a
Yeah.
fellow named Jeffrey Tarter. And it was the first time I made a newsletter. Jeffrey and I did it together, which was interesting in of itself. And he ended up, I just gave him my interest in it. So it was all his
Ah,
when I moved to California.
ah,
um, and Soft Letter was based on the idea that software was a new business. You heard a little bit about this from Great Uncle Joe. Um, the uh, that when the computer business started, there was no software. Software was built on a computer, so you'd buy a computer and then you build your own software, and which was true for IBM. And then when digital equipment started, um, there were people that were making programs for DEC, but it was still almost all purpose built. The personal computer, when it started, there was no software industry. There's no
yeah. Yeah.
model for being a software company. In fact, the early programs, many of them games, were packaged in baggies, like Ziploc bags, with a disk and a manual. And because no one knew how to make a package for software. Now packages don't exist anymore anyway, because it's all on the internet. But they had to be sold through stores because there was no. So there was a distribution system. So the first
Oh,
people that made a computer store were innovators themselves. They kind of figured out how to sell stuff and what it should look like it's like looking at weed stores. You go into a weed store and they all have different ways of like
yeah. Yeah.
selling the
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
It was
Oh,
kind of like that back then. It was like you walk into a computer store, you weren't really sure what you would find.
that must have been so interesting to see Best Buy grow.
Well, Best Buy already existed and never really figured out computers. They sold, I mean, Best Buy still sells refrigerators
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
washing
Yeah. Yeah.
machines.
Yeah.
They were a
Wow.
scaled up home goods store that got in and did sell and does sell computers, but it's never been a big part of their business.
So interesting.
That's why Apple stores are a phenomenon. It's also an interesting phenomenon that Apple started their own stores and ended up selling most of their products through their own stores. They controlled everything from all the way from the chip through the operating system to the application interfaces to, you know, the app store to the way the products are sold. Incredible. If
Mm.
anything, they should be accused of being a horizontal monopoly, but
Horizontal monopoly.
or vertical monopoly. Sorry.
A vertical monopoly. Interesting. So
Yeah.
that's a new framework for understanding a monopoly, which is a vertical versus a, and that's what all, would you say all ambitious companies want to be both a
Oh yeah, they want to
horizontal
control everything.
and vertical?
That was the
Yeah,
original
yeah, yeah,
theory of
yeah,
antitrust was applied to oil companies
yeah.
because Standard Oil drilled for the oil, brought it up,
Oh,
moved it, had the gas stations and sold it to the consumer. That was considered antitrust. Well, the other one with the railroads, but
whereas Apple created a horizontal.
no, it's still
No,
vertical. They got the whole stack is
yeah.
controlled by Apple. In fact, I just, I don't think I finished reading it. I was reading an article about Apple versus Qualcomm, which they hate each other, like literally hate each other. And
Mm-hmm.
people at Apple hate Qualcomm because they don't trust them, and Qualcomm hates Apple because they think
Whoa.
they're trying to screw them. Because Qualcomm owns patents that are critical to mobile communications, 5G, and so Apple has to buy Qualcomm chips to enable mobile communications in the iPhone, and it's fascinating. I mean, this is trying to remember where I saw this, but and there was a background story on the whole relationship between the two companies. Now, Qualcomm's like a gnat, they're 10% of the revenue of Apple, um, and so they're a multi-billion-dollar company. They're very successful, but they've got Apple by the balls, and Apple does not like to have its balls held by someone else.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. There's a
But
few different podcasts we should do next time. One of which is on what you just mentioned, why they hate each other. Another one, we could do like five of them on open source, history of open source, because I feel like open source is really important for AI, as most people now do, but I would say never,
yeah,
but long
yeah,
term. Um, but and then this, I love this idea of the CEO as king, sort of among a company, among a monopoly, but then now it's kind of going back into the political, which feels really important. Well, no, it always was that way with, as we were just discussing, with the monopolies and stuff. But all more we can talk about later, because we got to get to San Telmo to go do some fun art walking. All right.
See you in a
next
bit.
week. Yep.